Hello, I'm here with Colin Bodayle, doctoral student at Villanova University in the Department of Philosophy, student of, Gabriel Rockhill, I guess, and some other people. I mean, you studied with more than just Gabriel, but
yeah.
Your primary research interests are Marx, Hegel, and Heidegger, probably more Hegel and Heidegger than even Marx. And you tend to read in a kind of dialectical paradigm. I know you're a big fan of Domenico Lacerda, who I have had my disagreements with, but we agree that the left and Heidegger needs to be read more critically. And one of the weirdest things, now I read your essay on Heidegger that you originally published out at Monthly Review and then on your own Substack on the channel. And Colin, a lot of people compared us to conservatives who dish Marx but don't read him. And the funny thing is, your critique is one of the few critiques of Heidegger that engages with the text. It's not just based off of the Black Notebooks or the fact he was a Nazi. It's not just that. You actually try to work through and show that it isn't an accident or just epiphenomenal to Heidegger's project with fascism. So why is it? I always think about the big three intellectual German Nazis, the ones that have been maintained. Werner Sombart, who's mostly been erased because for some reason people don't want to deal with that one, but was super important in the middle 20th century. Carl Schmitt, who gets resurrected all the time, can't seem to be kept down, and Heidegger.
Mm-hmm.
And Heidegger's the one that there's the most dissembling about. The other two, I mean, even people who use and like Schmitt come out and say, yes, he was a Nazi jurist.
Mm-hmm.
Except for some people who pretend he was a revolutionary conservative, which he may have been at one time. And maybe that's getting around the laws in Russia where you can't actually cite and endorse fascist, but nonetheless. But in general, people admit what Schmitt was. Why do you think so many otherwise well-meaning left liberal people turn their head in a case so unambiguous like Heidegger?
Yeah, it's a good question. Right, because you could also point to Frege. Just that's a more funny one, but people don't even know about that. I just found out about that recently. So why is it with Heidegger? I guess it's like it would be interesting to look at the history of it, like from a historical materials perspective, and actually see who was behind the reception. And I don't know a ton about that, but there are weird things like Jean Beaufret was the guy who Heidegger wrote the letter on humanism to. And a lot of people don't know that he was right-wing and an anti-Semite and a Holocaust denier. But as for why, I think I don't know. I mean, maybe just a lot of people read Heidegger when they were younger. A lot of people got into it. I also think that he fits into this narrative of kind of this very idealist, historicist tendency in continental philosophy. This way to see everything, all truth, as just a kind of function of history or subjectivity or institutions or something like that. But yeah, it's I think for me personally, being I had heard that Heidegger was a Nazi before I read Being in Time. I think I was 18, right? And then I read Being in Time, and I was like, wow, this is I've never read anything quite like this before. And part of it too was that it was really, really difficult, right? The language was incredibly difficult. Heidegger redefines all of these words. And so I feel like there's something about wanting to dive into a text that's very mysterious. He promises you this answer to the question of being that goes all the way back to the pre-Socratics. And you get caught up in this project of trying to figure out what it means. And because you invest so much intellectual labor into understanding the text, you kind of want all that to pay off. And so then when someone threatens that by like calling out the political dimension of Heidegger's thought, you feel like you've wasted all the, you feel like if you have to give up what you've invested time into, you've wasted all of that time, right?
Right. I remember in the 90s when I was coming up and I was in high school, and I read I read a short fragment of Heidegger. I was trying to understand Nietzsche, who I got obsessed with as a 16-year-old, as a stereotypical 16-year-old. And I got to Nietzsche through the kinds of French literature you often encounter in high school, and then you come back to when you're like 40, which is Camus and Sartre and the French existentialist, and the debates between the Marxist end of that and the absurdist end of that. And I got to Nietzsche, I read Birth of Tragedy, and I got to Heidegger on Nietzsche, and I remember thinking, oh fuck, I really have to learn German. Which is my also response when I first read Hegel, which I think I was like 19 when I started reading Phenomenology of Spirit. Where like, oh shit, I'm going to need to learn German. And I did actually. I sat down. The only reason I studied German was I was totally obsessed with these German existentialists and trying to figure them out. And I remember discovering that Heidegger had a relationship to the Nazi Party, and I remember it being weird when reading things like, you know, that uber liberal magazine that I don't even know if it still exists. Does Salon still exist anymore? But anyway, in the 90s, reading Salon, and they're talking about how strange it was that Sartre was a communist because of the assumptions of existentialism. But they didn't call out how strange it was that Heidegger was a fascist. And so I was like, well, if existentialism's all about your existence before essence and individual, how do you get to blood and soil nationalism? That seems even less obvious to me than communism. And I never really got an answer, but I was really surprised, and I do mean this, like in the 90s and aughts, how little people talked about Heidegger's politics at all. And it wasn't like Nietzsche where there is plausible deniability, right? Like you can, even not accepting Kaufman, it took me a long time to come over to the Nietzsche is as reactionary as it feels like he might be. Reading.
Yeah.
That's not true with Heidegger. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But it's not obvious what Heidegger means. So
yeah. Although if you're in the, I don't know, what's the word? I don't know if I'm using this correctly. The habitus of Heidegger scholarship, is that the right term for it? Right?
Yeah, I would say so.
There are excuses within Heidegger scholarship for this. There are like ways of justifying it. I mean, because think of how many Heidegger scholars are Jewish too, right? And
tons.
Tons, right?
Hannah Arendt started that by sleeping with him, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Derrida, right, all these people. There's usually like a few different like strategies. So if you look at someone like Hubert Dreyfus, which I think is a lot of people when they first get into Heidegger, they first get into Hubert Dreyfus because he has his courses on YouTube, and that's the kind of analytic, easy version of Heidegger. And then you find out that it's not really Heidegger. But yeah, like for him, he's just like, I'm going to just cut off all of Division 2 as worthless, but the analytic philosophy and what I can like basically rewrite in Heidegger is all in like the beginning. And then, you know, there's like all of the being and time purists too, who, you know, you can just say that's where the existentialism is. And then he became a Nazi for reasons that made no sense or whatever, right? You can kind of pretend that there's no link there. But then there are people who argue that Heidegger was either single focused on education, and that what he wanted to do was implement educational reforms to go back to kind of a more 19th century arrangement of education being around philosophy at the center, as opposed to this kind of technical, everything specialized version of things. And then there's the claim, and Heidegger tries to sell this, but it's pretty demonstrably false, that Heidegger was only a Nazi for 1 year. That's what his official story is. And then after that, he engaged in a secret resistance against Nazism and had to self-censor and all of this stuff. That's like his claim. And
so he was secretly Ernst Jünger the whole time, is what he's basically claiming.
Yeah. That's what. Yeah, actually, speaking of, if we're gonna, I guess we will say the name of the devil, Alexander Dugin. If you read Alexander Dugin's book on Heidegger, that's his claim too, is that Heidegger was secretly working for conservative revolution against Hitlerism or something like this. But you find liberals who say this too, but it's very demonstrably false. There's in the book, Introduction to Metaphysics, there's this passage in here where Heidegger says something like, the inner truth and greatness of our movement of National Socialism. All right. You may be familiar with this. Is like, it's really shocking because this was in there, and this was one of the first books published by Heidegger in English. And so a lot of people, it was right there in front of everyone. But Heidegger claims that he wrote in the manuscript in terms of the confrontation with technology. And then he says, but I was too afraid to say that because the Gestapo was watching my classes because they knew I was resisting the party. Right. And then if you go and look for the actually official manuscript from like the Heidegger archives, guess what one page is missing from that manuscript conveniently? That exact page where Heidegger allegedly had this thing he never read. And I think it was actually Habermas and I haven't figured out where, but it was apparently the young Habermas who actually figured out that Heidegger completely faked this fake resistance. And there are other places where people have where Heidegger said really Nazi things, like pro-Hitler, pro-Mussolini things. Like I think there's a Schelling lecture where he says it. And in the process, Heidegger or his family or whoever have edited these things out of the Gesamtausgabe, of the official Heidegger manuscripts. And if you're really deep into Heidegger scholarship and into the criticals, it's a kind of secret that's kind of open among these kind of high-level Heidegger scholars that we're not working with original manuscripts. Like they've all been edited to take out this stuff. So it is interesting. That's part of the reason too why I was like, I could list all of his crimes or whatever, but there are people who have done that way better than I could do, for sure. And the manuscripts we have are not even true manuscripts. He's edited out fascist stuff. It's funny. I think one of the things that really convinced me that it was that Nazism or some kind of far right philosophy, because it is a flavor of far right philosophy that you find in Heidegger. It's not identical. They're not all identical. He didn't think the same thing as every single,
Yeah, he's not the same as Giovanni Gentile, for example.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But I read the Holderlin seminars from 1934 with Christopher Finsk at Duquesne. And he wanted to read them, because usually there's the way I was used to seeing people read Heidegger was either, one, oh, is he really a Nazi? Or, is that just, something people attribute to this? Or can we deconstruct it away from that? Or it's he's a Nazi, kill him. Let's find out all the dirt on him. And Finsk's reading was, he's a conservative revolution philosopher. Let's read him for his revolutionary philosophy of conservative revolution. And then when we did that reading in the class, which I did really closely, in the German and stuff, I was like, yeah, this guy's a fucking Nazi. It's just,
right.
It's very, very deep into his political theory. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is something that I've seen as plausible deniability for a lot of German reactionary thinkers, is to tie them to the conservative revolution because they have an ostensible critique of fascism. And sure, I mean, there are people like Oswald Spengler and Edgar Young, who basically thought fascism was too liberal. And there's people like Thomas Mann who are more, and even Ernst Jünger, who are more ambivalent figures. Not people who I would endorse, by the way, but are at least legitimately interesting and were legitimately opposed to the Nazis most of the time. But it seems like a very convenient thing that I've seen done with both Heidegger and with Schmidt to say, oh, they were really conservative revolutionaries. They were just pretending to be fascist. And I'm like, okay.
Schmidt and Heidegger have a whole correspondence. Also, Heidegger has a correspondence with Ernst Jünger. I think a lot of people know about the Jünger correspondence because it's the essay where Heidegger crosses out being.
Right.
That Derrida really is like, takes that from or whatever. But these people were also like talking about German socialism, right? That's what they all call it, which is the same thing that like what's the guy's name? Strasser called it, right?
Strasser, Spengler, I mean the Prussian socialism and German socialism movement, which I mean you see in the German historical school, which is something I've actually studied a lot. And that's where stuff like MMT comes from. But also that's where Max Weber and Werner Sombart come from, and they're more of they're the thing that makes third periodism look true because they were basically soft social democrats. Not Weber so much. He doesn't live long enough for us to see him do this, but Sombart moved from Marxist to German historical school, Marxian to Nazi, in that order. And there's a lot of hand-wringing about that, because there's a want to distance the German socialism people, particularly in the German historical school, from Nazi and National Socialism, even though they use a lot of the same language, and they usually rely on Spengler and the fact Strasser was purged. And I mean, Hitler was almost first a Schachtian, and I mean that by the finance minister, and then almost a proto-neoliberal later on. But there was a lot of people in the German socialist movement and in the National Socialist movement, a lot of the right of the SPD who were pretty Nazi sympathetic. So it to me that doesn't even seem like an excuse.
And also, like, I wonder if it's like less interesting to just be like split hairs about it, or like it's like, oh well, like, technically not a Nazi because it's Nazi aligned movement, or like, and makes more sense to look at these as like kind of a spectrum of far right ideologies that will materially all act together if there is a fascist revolution, right? Or not revolution, but you know what I mean, a fascist movement.
What a good old counter revolution. Yeah, the conservative revolution,
right?
The conservative revolutionaries would have fought the Marxists just as hard.
Exactly, right. Because conservative revolution is not a revolution; it's a counter revolution as well,
right?
But
which they kind of
I don't know. Have you looked at Lasordo's book on Heidegger, perchance?
Not deeply. So, what is Lasordo's argument?
Yeah, I think you would enjoy it. I don't think I finished it. I think I still have like 30 pages left or something, but I've read most of it. So he situates, you know how like Lasordo likes to work from like Western Marxism, where he likes to look at a lot of different figures and kind of situate them in different time periods and be like, this person said this around here, this person said this around this thing, or around specific issues. And so what he does is he locates being and time and Heidegger's analysis of finitude within what he calls the war ideology, the Kriegsideologie, which is like this idea of like, hey, y'all remember when World War I was happening and we were all like dying on the front lines and like everything like was like really like intense? Y'all, that shit was lit. Let's go back and go to war, right? Like Junger's novels are all like kind of romanticizing war. And then there's this idea that the whole German public was mobilized around, even like people who weren't fighting were like in the hospitals working or whatever. And so he takes being towards death and shows how it's a kind of trope that can be found around this time period. And Germans are already death obsessed, like go back to the 19th century, right? And if you look at I think it's in the Holderlin seminars, Heidegger talks about the closeness of the soldiers to the front. There's a line in Being in Time about like struggle and communication, like referring, I think, to the battlefield as these things that bring the community together around a common like history and around what he calls the Gemeinschaft, or the community. So there are these like already in Being in Time, this kind of ideology that's building up that can be found in figures on the right who were adjacent to fascism, and people on the right who were opposed or, you know, not going along with the Nazis for personal reasons, like Karl Jaspers, which is somebody that you used to get talked about a lot, and nobody talks about Jaspers anymore. I'm not sure why. I don't know a ton about him, but one thing we'll sort of brings up is that he had a lot of the similar death ideology. He had a lot of like affinities with certain German socialism. His wife was Jewish, though, so he couldn't really
right. Yeah,
go along,
I mean,
right?
Jaspers is interesting in that, at least from what I read by Roland, who's more liberal than Lacerdo, but does good history on this. He didn't try to do that apolitical Heidegger thing that that Arendt did. Like he did not. He didn't go there, even though his thought, to me, Jasper's thought is really, really indebted to Heidegger in some ways. Like a lot of his actual age notions and his epoch seem related, but maybe it's because it's indebted to prior stuff. I've read Jasper's in English a long time ago, so like
I don't think I ever actually read Jaspers, unless it was like something in like, you know, when I was like 18 in some book on existentialism or something, right? But you know, it's interesting about Arendt too, because if you look at Arendt's politics, I mean, they're really Heideggerian politics, and they're not left-wing politics either. I don't like. No. They're not at all. I don't know why so many people like. They're not liberal either. Like they're conservative. They're fascy. I don't know. Like it's alarming when you really look at some of like Arendt's ideas about. I mean, it has that kind of Nietzschean idea of like this aristocratic kind of Greek person over on top of society, supported by the people beneath them, right? That's kind of her defense of slavery, is that the slave classes, as bad as that was, let like Aristotle and Plato do their thing, right? So I don't know, it's like, it's weird. She's like another figure who is placed on, is kind of treated as a left-wing figure, just like most people reading Heidegger, either liberals or on, you know, left of center at least, right? Derrida too, right? Like,
yeah. Well, Derrida's interesting. Not to bring up old controversies, but like I remember the Paul de Man controversy.
That's what I was about to say. Yeah,
like the fact that so many of these deconstructionists were like, I don't know, affiliated with the Nazi Party, always was like, what? Like, because you wouldn't get that from Derrida. But I also remember, I mean, when I read Derrida in university, which I was an undergrad in English at the time, and I was also in analytic philosophy studying Nietzsche and German, but I remember reading Derrida and going, this is a really complicated ass way to get to a paragraph of Heidegger. Basically, like I just read Of Grammatology, and it's like, I just read a 400-page book to like go through the experience of a point Heidegger made in a paragraph. And it really made me mad. And what is interesting to me is that while there's been some attempt to like re-leftify Derrida, Mark Fisher bringing him up a lot, actually, in his ontology book and stuff like that, Derrida like fell out of left academia really fast. Like went from dominating it when I was an undergrad and graduate school to like being barely discussed at all within, I don't know, 7 years. It was pretty fast.
Yeah. I think that's like part of it too. Like I think, I mean, he's like so Heidegger adjacent, right?
Right.
And like we've seen an intensification of politics since like, when was it? Like, I feel like there was, I'm just like a little bit going blank on like my timeline here, but when I was in graduate school, before I was in graduate school, people were reading Heidegger and they were also Marxist, and they were just like, hey, can we like do both of these things? And then at a certain point with the kind of intensification of culture war issues, I guess, from the left. Like it became just like, no, you can't read Nazis anymore, right? Like kind of thing. And then I feel like Derrida got kind of pushed away with that. Like, right, so who's gonna want to do deconstruction when it's based on Heidegger's conception of metaphysics and all of these kinds of things?
Well, and you saw the shift to like Deleuze and Guattari as opposed to Derrida. I mean, that's what I noticed was like, Deleuze and Guattari became hip, and we just don't talk about deconstruction hardly at all anymore. We might mention the structuralism conference at Johns Hopkins as like some major important thing, and then like never talk about what the politics of it actually were. And if we do talk about Derrida, we're going to talk about some of the late books like Spectres of Marx, which are very liberal readings of Marx. I mean, it's going back and I actually recently went back and read that because it comes up in a Fisher piece. And I was surprised how like, oh, this feels like whatever the talking points were in 1997. Like, now you and I are not the same ages. I'm a little bit older than you, I think. Probably younger than your teachers and older than you. But it was very interesting because the other thing is, I think people forget in the late 90s that like stuff like Heart and Negri were bestsellers.
Really?
Like Empire was on the New York Times bestseller list, which is crazy to think about now. Because that also feels like it's just completely fallen away and we don't mention it anymore. And, you know, one of the things I'd be interested in is, I mean, how much does the role of the kind of questionable role of the French existentialists play into this? Before we get into the actual like philosophy in it, because you already covered that somewhat, but like why, like Sartre being somewhat respected even by normies, you know, on the left and the depoliticized world. How much do you think that plays into this? Because, and then also Heidegger's relationship to Lacan, maybe, because I've been trying to figure that out for a long time.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's weird, like, because Sartre was the most famous intellectual until he died in, I believe, 1980 on the dot, right? And he was kind of a figure like Noam Chomsky might have been in the 90s or 2000s, right? Where every time something political happened, you see what Sartre's positions were on it. And Sartre had, with the exception of Palestine, pretty decent political positions and was a committed communist. Beauvoir as well, like her writings on politics are woefully understudied because she's placed in a kind of feminist box. But I feel like a lot of people, when they first get into existentialism, because it does speak to something that people who are teenagers really think about and resonate with, they start with the Sartre and then they're told to go read Heidegger, right? And so Sartre is always presented as the kind of like, oh, this is like the crappy existentialism. You need to read the real existentialism kind of stuff. And so maybe that moves students away from what could be a more radical wrestling with existentialism. Now, I think it is true that like Sartre is indebted to it is like a weird Heidegger and a weird Hegel because it's like really kind of nascent in terms of being studied in France in that time. The translations aren't good. Like what you have for Hegel is like Kojève's lectures. I don't even think like a lot of people were reading.
I was gonna say it's mostly Kojève.
Yeah, right. Until you have Hippolyte really like work this all out. Weirdly, I think I read somewhere that Hippolyte didn't attend Kojève's lectures because he didn't want to be spoiled, have his like reading spoiled by them, which is interesting. But yeah, like I think there are elements of Sartre that are definitely, I mean, he's a phenomenologist in a lot of ways, right? And so he's going to begin from that standpoint of subjectivity. He's a pretty good phenomenologist as far as like that discipline goes. Like his essays on like the transcendence of the ego are quite interesting. But I think like he's someone who did so much work from the standpoint of subjectivity and beginning with the transcendental ego and experience and all of this kind of stuff, and then realized he needed to be a materialist for political reasons. and kept going with that. I've never read the Critique of Dialectical Reason. I know a few people have. I'd like to at some point, but he has a book like Search for Method. That's an attempt to kind of figure this out. He goes to like a kind of Kantian regulative ideal as like a kind of guiding principle of totality for linking things together and stuff like that. So,
I feel like he kind of accidentally bumps his way through parts of the entire German idealist tradition, just like trying to wrap around how you start from this radical subjectivity and tie it back into materialism, which, to be fair, I actually do think is a problem for Marxists. Like, it's not easy. I used to try to figure out like what Marx thought ideas were, and then I remember reading the E.P. Thompson Althusser debates and being like, oh, I see where both these guys are coming from, actually. Like, this is not an easy question. So to get it back to Heidegger, though, what about Heidegger's philosophy, because of that focus on authenticity, like, how do you get this idea of a collective folk from this idea of radical authenticity to yourself? Because that is what that is the bridge that I think is clearly there. I've read a lot of Heidegger. It seems to be there, and I've even read Dugan talk about this too. And yet it's hard for me to see how you get there for most people, and I think that's what I think most people miss it because it's not obvious.
Okay, I think I can maybe dive into this and explain how I think it gets there. So authenticity in someone like Sartre, the way I read it, and I haven't done a very close reading of Being and Nothingness, so I might have some things wrong about this, but going off like his kind of more popular stuff, I take it that he understands authenticity to be kind of this humanist idea, like you create your life as a kind of work of art or a project in that sense, right? Like I am, but I also bind everyone to this project in a certain way, and I give a model of how I think human beings should be with the way I act. I don't think that's anything like Heidegger's authenticity. Heideggerian authenticity is rooted in this Nietzschean idea of use and disuse. It comes from the use and disuse of history essay of like looking to the past and finding a hero to emulate or a model to emulate. Right. And so this could be, kind of innocent, right? Like you could be like, oh, I want to, right. Like you read, like, I'm trying to think of someone who's not just like, I was going to say Wittgenstein, but he's kind of a weirdo. You probably shouldn't imitate him, but like, some like philosopher that you read about and you read how they live their life, or you read about, Marx or Lenin or someone like that. And you see that as a model and you try to model yourself on their greatness or something like that. That could be like a kind of one way of seeing it. But for Heidegger, there's this sense of like finding possibilities for the folk in history, right? So like it's this idea of looking back at historical figures and seeing them as kind of having an authority or being a kind of model for the future. But in each repetition, or it's like the Wiederholung is the German word, like there's a kind of like newness to the repetition of the old. And so I think that this Heideggerian temporality plays itself out in the kind of like modus operandi of most continental philosophy these days, which is like reading and rereading. And then like, if you like, here's, my views on XYZ text. And they're like, well, what's new about your reading? And it's just like, well, my reading's correct. Like, it's like, no, it has to be a new reading and rereading. Like you have to go back to whatever, Nietzsche, the pre-Socratics, and present it in some radically new way. I think that also that is like the political kind of impulse, at least of Being in Time. And you find it, I think, in later works too, where the the history of the people is somehow has this this becomes this kind of model for how the folk is unified in struggle, or something along these lines, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you find it in like some of the left-wing Heideggerianisms that we're so familiar with, right? We need to go, like, there's like I won't mention any names, but I think most people know who I'm talking about. Like, right, like they talk about in there's like the Dmitriev essay that talks about how fascism always goes and looks for these like heroes for the past to bring and like use as these kind of models to capture the imagination of the people and bind them to the folk, right? Like Joan of Arc, George Washington, whoever, right? There's a sense in which even some of the kind of left Heideggerian movements we're seeing pop up that are kind of, bringing some right wing or conservative elements in, also kind of make this move of like, we need to have, I don't know, Alexander Hamilton communism or George Washington communism, or, I don't know, maybe you could do it with Joan of Arc too, or something like that. And there's this sense in which Heidegger's politics involves bringing up the ghosts of the past. And I think like I've heard too that like this is why the Nazis didn't like Heidegger, is because like his idea of conservative revolution was like, we need to read the pre-Socratics, and they're like, well, who can even relate to that, right? But there's a sense in which like someone like Holderlin for Heidegger, in writing these poems about these German rivers, creates this sense of like love of the Heimat, right? The love of the homeland in people. And there's something where, if you really look at what authenticity is for Heidegger, he talks about it, I think it's in the Call of Conscience section, that it's making up for not choosing. It's not like you're like, I'm going to be different, or I'm going to be unique, or I'm going to be, go the Sartre route, and it's like, I'm going to be a model of what I think a human being should be. It's that you're making up for not choosing where you've been thrown, and you're taking it on as your own project. Right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's always been interesting to me about Heidegger is that there's obviously this Nietzschean strain, although his Nietzsche is actually particular. It's not Nietzsche, even if we both agree Nietzsche's. I think it should be uncritically stated that Nietzsche's a reactionary, and you have to depoliticize him to deal with that. And while you might argue that there's useful things in Nietzsche for the left, I am agnostic, but having thought about it for a long time, I'm more and more leaning to mostly no. There is this interesting other relation to the other counter-Enlightenment German philosophers, which is something to think about, because I think we have to deal with this. I don't want to go all, Isaiah Berlin Anglo-liberal school here, but like there is something to the late Romantics and their relation to Heidegger's thought, which I do think we have to deal with, and it shows up in his love of Holderlin, is basically what I'm trying to say. What do you make about that? Like, do you think that's an important strain there that maybe is the missing element of understanding how you get from this existentialist thinker who also has a like voluntary blood and soil existential commitment? Like,
yeah, I don't know. Like, Heidegger's reading of Holderlin is so weird, and he's trying to like, I mean, like the really kind of like obviously weird thing about Heidegger is him making up words, right? Like he constantly feels like you need a new language to do philosophy. And so like if you read him like doing the Holderlin seminars, he's like trying to like take Holderlin and turn it into like make it weirder and weirder and weirder so he can develop new concepts out of what Holderlin's saying, kind of like he does with the pre-Socratics, this like whole like deconstructive reading or whatever. And like part of it is like him developing the starting points for what will later be the fourfold, das Gewährt, which I don't know. There's a good book by Andrew Mitchell explaining the fourfold that's quite accessible and clear and all this stuff. But every time I've read Heidegger talk about the fourfold, I'm like, this is his last concept. Like this is his solution. Like what we need to solve the riddle of being is this like God's, mortals, earth, sky shit. Like really, like what even is this? Like I feel like at that point, that's like the people who have invested so much into understanding it that they feel like they have to hold on to this concept of the fourfold. But all of this weirdness and all of these kind of archaic or esoteric terms really come from him mining into Holderlin. And I'm not sure, besides Holderlin's attachment to Germany, I'm not really sure. Like I guess that's part of the like appeal for Heidegger. But like the way he's reading him is so like idiosyncratic, like, you know, like where the danger grows, there the saving power also. I mean, well, Holderlin wrote that it had nothing to do with technology, right? It's just kind of like Heidegger is pulling on and maybe it's just like he's pulling on the German past for the same reason that someone might pull on George Washington or Joan of Arc for right-wing purposes, right?
Yeah, what I was going to ask you then is, you know, there is the German idealist who we all should be a little afraid of, and that is Fichte.
Yeah,
and I know that Heidegger likes Fichte. So, you want to talk about that relationship a little bit about, you know?
I actually don't know anything about Heidegger's relationship to Fichte, unfortunately.
All right.
I think like he talks about Fichte, I think a few times here and there, usually with the I equals I stuff. But I'm not really familiar with like much of his work on Fichte, unfortunately. But yeah, there is a weird split in the German like liberal movement, like building up to the like revolution of 1848, where which I'd like to study in more detail. I'm not a historian. You probably studied it more than I have, but as I understand it, there's a split between the like liberal kind of more French revolutionary side of German revolutionaries. And then there's the people who are the German nationalists side of that. And they have things that they share in common with each other, and are, you know, both pushing towards the same goal of, you know, defeating the monarchy and, you know, creating a united Germany. But I happen to have noticed that one of the things that really distinguishes the liberals from nationalists in this like movement of 1848 is that the liberals want to incorporate Jewish people into society, and the nationals tend towards anti-Semitism. And I believe that, if I remember right, Fichte was more on the nationalist camp and was anti-Semitic, whereas someone like Hegel, who I read as being a liberal through and through, was against anti-Semitism and was against, I mean, you know, maybe he said some things that were not, you know, tasteful here and there or whatever, but he wanted Jews to have full political rights. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a thread there, one that a historian, as opposed to someone who's good at reading text closely, but somebody who's good at looking at like long historical trends like that, might have something really interesting to say about. But
yeah, one of the things that I got from the scholar Friedrich Besser was that neo-Kantianism kind of splits that way too, but you also see it with Fichte and the nationalist, and it doesn't always hit the way you think. Like Bruno Bauer is not someone I would have associated with the nationalist side, but he definitely is on it. So it's at least in that his quasi anti-Semitic writings that Marx is responding to that leads to on the Jewish question, et cetera, et cetera. And that tension does seem to be in all of German idealism, and people kind of cut in different sides. And I find that interesting because I tend to think of German idealism and, you know, some of the later counter-Enlightenment thinkers are the late German romantics like Klage and, you know, the bio thinkers and those people. As not having any relationship or being totally opposed to one another. Or I think of like Nietzsche, who I've misstated and I said he was a contemporary. He wasn't really a contemporary of Hegel. I mean, he was Hegel was much older than him, but like, and there's an explicit anti-Hegelianism in Nietzsche, but also weirdly, he doesn't reference Hegel directly a super lot. So
because he probably didn't read Hegel, let's be honest. Like,
right. Right. I mean, like, but if you were in the Prussian university at that time period, you have to deal with Hegelianism. There's no way not to. So, I find that interesting too. But I don't have a clear answer either, because it does seem to me there's a lot more intersections here. I mean, one of the things I was fascinated with Fichte was I started reading the work of Erich von Rhee, who is a historian of, believe it or not, Stalin. But he started going on the kind of right-wing socialism in one country kick in the right of the SPD, not the Kautsky faction, but the faction to the right of even them, who were like arguing for German imperialism as a means for socialism and stuff like that, who are part of Ebert's core. And so many of them loved Fichte, and a lot of them became Nazis. Like, boom, boom, boom. And it's really interesting to see that. Now I do think, so I read a lot of history. I want people to understand. Some people think I'm a historian. I'm not. I'm actually trained mostly in poetry and anthropology, and I write on intellectual history sometimes. But I'm not a trained historian. But it does seem like there's the people who do the history of this and the reception history, and then there's the philosophers, and they don't talk very much. Lasordo is actually one of the few exceptions. So
which is why I like Lasordo. It is hard to do because, like, this is something I've noticed as someone who's trying to do both, but my skill set's more in the philosophy side of it, and so like one thing is like you might like this given your profession, different styles of reading.
Right.
Historians read 100, 150 pages a day. Philosophers read 20 pages a day. If it's Hegel, 5 pages a day. You know what I mean?
if it's Hegel, 5 pages a day, if you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
Particularly if you're reading it in German, it's more like 1 page a day, and I need 2 different translations and an index. And someone needs to make sure I got my Swabian dialect down. Like, it's that bad.
What made me actually be able to read German fluently without a dictionary is I once decided no more translations while I was in grad school. And then I took that Heidegger class with Christopher Finsk at Duquesne, and he assigned 80 pages of the Holderlin seminars a week. And so I literally was like 12 hours a day all weekend, like trying to read this thing. And then after that, I was set. Like, but it's hard enough because it's Heidegger. So half the shit he says is playing on etymology. You've encountered before. Like, it's just like, if you read in English, you're like, wait, what did these things have anything to do with each other? And then you like look in German, like, like Geschichte, Geschick, Schicken, Geschehen. Like, oh, okay, he's playing on something, which is weird too. I feel like I feel like people like, what does this sound like to German speakers? Is what I really want to know. Because like I learned German originally to study Heidegger and then later, Hegel and stuff like that. But like, think about like something like the word Dasein.
Right.
We know this word probably first through Heidegger, if anything.
Yeah, I didn't encounter it much otherwise.
Yeah. But the word Dasein has a meaning in German that is not what Heidegger's meaning is, aside from, associations with Heidegger now. So if you look at the pre-critical Kant, Kant has that essay called The Only Possible Proof of the Existence of God. Word existence there is Dasein. Dasein literally just is how you would render the Latin existentia. But there's like a little note in Being in Time that nobody really noticed except me. And like I found like maybe one other scholar who even pays attention to this, where Heidegger says, Normally, the word existentially is translated as Dasein. I'm going to be translating this as Vorhandenheit, as presence at hand. So presence at hand is Heidegger using existence in the like thatness sense throughout being in time, whereas Dasein is his term for the type of being that we are. Not the type, not the being that we have, but not the Sein that we have, but the Seiende that we are, the being, the entity that we are. And then the being of this entity is Existenz with a Z, the German word that is a like more transliteration of existentia.
Right.
And like reading this, if you were to read this in German, you'd be like, what the fuck is going on here? And so when you read it in English, you kind of just accept that Dasein, it means human being, right? And this is probably the only association you have with it until you get later ones later, maybe from reading Hegel in German or something like this, right? Where Dasein is the second category of the logic that has where quality is and all that, right?
Which threw me for a loop when I hit it after reading Heidegger for a long time. Because I went through the phenomenology in English, then in German, and then I'm like, I'm going to read the logic. And then I was like, wait, I have too much 20th century baggage to understand what is being spoken about here, because clearly Hegel can't mean the same thing as Heidegger. That is absolutely clear.
Yeah.
So
it is fun to pretend that he does, though, because it does make a cool reading of being in time. But yes, he does not. Because it's fun. It can be fun to pretend he does, just because of the infinite being the resolution of it, because you can read being in time through the lens of the logic as denying the move to infinity. That all aside, what's interesting though is when I read Lukács in the Destruction of Reason on Heidegger, like he really like pinned down what Heidegger's really doing, because Heidegger claims to have this solution, or I mean maybe he doesn't even, like he kind of says this, but like everyone says this about Heidegger, that Heidegger, we need Heidegger because he solved the subject object distinction somehow. What Heidegger really does is he replaces the subject with human existence, like the thatness of human beings. So instead of saying like all of history and all of objectivity and everything scientific, all truth is relative and contained within the transcendental ego, he says it's all relative to the thatness of human beings.
And that's a pretty big difference, actually.
Yeah.
Can we talk about like the implications of that? That's actually pretty profound.
Yeah. So, well, to get something out of the way that I mentioned in the article and kind of repeat myself here, there is this what I call subjective idealism that emerges from this, where if objects and objectivity are relative to whether or not to human Dasein, and human existence, then if human beings do not exist, there are no truths, there are no objectivities, there's no Newton's laws, there's nothing. And so you end up in that problem that Meursault talks about in After Finitude. Have you read that book, After Finitude?
Oh God, I do believe I read it in 2010 or 2011, somewhere. I think when it first came out, but I haven't touched it since then.
Yeah, it's really short, but his like argument is that he basically says that like idealists and Heideggerians are like young Earth creationists, basically, right? Because there's not before human beings, there's nothing. And when you look at Heidegger and how his theory of time works, and what his theory of, for Heidegger, what he calls the present at hand, which in this footnote that no one seems to have noticed, he says is like his translation of the normal sense of existence, only emerges out of this like shift from the practical into the theoretical, where we then like objectify and like individuate an object like against the background of the world, right? And all of this occurs within like the horizon of Dasein's ecstatic temporality, like Dasein time, basically. And objective time, like clock time, for Heidegger, is stripping the existential time of its significance and dulling it down and universalizing it. That's something that Heidegger gets from Nietzsche too, that I don't think people always notice, that like Heidegger sees, you get really like into some weird trippy far right shit by like this with this argument. Heidegger sees as like science, by treating objects as following like universal laws and as empirically verifiable and objective, is like liberalism, because it treats everything as equal and everything having the same rank. So it's like has some kind of synergy with liberalism, and maybe that's part of the kind of like left infection with Heidegger in a way too, like that there you could see left perspectives to make this argument as well, that like the flattening out of objectivity is somehow like rooted in a liberal ideology, and treating everything in the same way. I mean, even Lukács says something like this at one point, I think, in the one of his essays, I think the Orthodox Marxism one essay or something like that. Like he says something about yeah. And
no,
that's
it comes
like,
up in early in the History and Class Consciousness book. It does,
yeah, exactly. And so there's like, and he associates this with Christianity too. This, you know, in some ways, maybe it's even like an inverted Hegelianism too, right? Because Hegel sees Christianity as bringing the idea of freedom forward and equality. I think this is pretty Eurocentric of him, but you know, whatever. The whole idea of ranking religions is kind of suspect to me. But Heidegger, like Nietzsche, right? Like Nietzsche doesn't, when Nietzsche says something like Jesus the Jew, right? Like Kaufman says that, oh, Nietzsche is like sticking it to the anti-Semites who are Christians. It's like, no. Nietzsche and Heidegger too are so anti-Semitic that they're anti-Christian, because they're like, that's too Semitic, right?
Which is the plain reading of actually the genealogy of morals. Like I don't like it. It's there. Like it's
nuts to me that people like still try to claim, like professors who teach classes on Nietzsche still try to claim that Nietzsche is a left-wing figure. Have you read the books? And maybe this is because, like, you know, I grew up in the South, and so I was taught Nietzsche by like conservatives, right? And so it's like,
me too. I was taught Nietzsche and Hegel by Nietzschean and Hegelian conservatives. So
yeah, right. And then it's just like, yeah, it's like Nietzsche hates liberalism, and you're just like, yeah, obviously he does. Like, it's like, yeah, Nietzsche like doesn't care about anyone except like powerful people, and you know, the rest of the people should just like fall in line to the powerful. And also, you're studying philosophy, right? So you're special. Like, you should be like Nietzsche and not care about, you don't get involved in the world of politics or, you know, fighting for anything, because, right, like you're trying to ascend or whatever. Like, that's the reading of Nietzsche that I feel like I was exposed to. And if you read the text, that's kind of what he says. And then like, that's not to condemn everything in Nietzsche. I don't think we should form a politics out of Nietzsche, but I mean, there's some like life advice in Nietzsche that I like in some passages, right? Like,
yeah, I don't mind like his stuff about, you know, not trusting people with too much urge to punish and stuff like. But like, the other thing is, when Nietzsche is systemic, it is when he is most suspect, and that's the thing that I think that I look at the most. He's not systemic all the time, but like when I see systemic things, I'm like, okay. So the Jews are in position of slave morality. Sure, he has a problem with anti-Semites, but it's not because he loves Jews. Like, it's like,
right. Yeah. Yeah, and then you get into like, I mean, it starts using like the Aryan and versus Semitic language, which I know like there are people who just use that because those are language categories or whatever. But like there's the passage in Dawn, or I think it is like 206 too, where he talks about like he literally describes just like sending 3/4 of the reserve army of labor to the colonies to let them like go like off and like live their like violent desires. And then he says we should bring the Chinese in because they're industrious ants to do all the labor for us. And it's like, I'm pretty sure that like Aimé Césaire describes like the exact same ideological claims, like almost word for word in Discourse on Colonialism, as what Nietzsche says there. But
yeah, it's special.
Yeah,
I mean, the stuff about the blonde beast is, I mean, like,
yeah,
like I remember when far rightists would quote Nietzsche, and I'm being like, well, you know what? They actually, unless you're bracketing out the will to power with the Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche thing, and just pretending that she wrote all of it, and I'll buy that she edited it sketchily. I haven't actually dealt with the archives of the of Nietzsche to say one way or the other. But like to be like, oh no, she wrote that. Like, no, it reads like Nietzsche. Like the right wingers aren't wrong. That reads like Nietzsche. And I don't need a special like dispensation from Walter Kaufman to somehow get around that. Because what Kaufman's whole argument is based on bracketing all that out. You just can't. You have to pretend it's not Nietzsche at all. Like,
and Kaufman too. Like, I mean, if you, something I noticed recently, the Viking Portable Nietzsche was one of the first Nietzsche texts available in English, right?
Yep, first one I read actually in high school.
Yeah,
and it was a Kaufman translation of Genealogy and Morals that I got in high school too as a 16-year-old. The one published, I think it was in the 80s. But
So at some point, I would recommend going through the Viking Portable Nietzsche and looking for ellipses, and then going to the original text and seeing what Kaufman took out. It's funny. And like, I don't know, there's one I want to look up because it's like Nietzsche's like, and then the Jews, ellipses. It's like, okay, wait, what? Like,
yeah,
Kaufman, you took out a passage here. Why is that? Like, So why is Heidegger still like such a big deal for so many philosophers? I mean, even like Zizek, right? Who, I mean, hey, you can make plenty of criticisms of Zizek, and a lot of older philosophy people don't even consider him to be doing anything significant. But like, you'll see people say that we have to accept the critique of ontotheology from Heidegger, right? That's like a big one. And the critique of metaphysics. But I don't even really know, like, what are people really attached to here? Because as I understand Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, it's that metaphysics is an attempt to determine being in general, usually through some like paradigm being grounded in an account of being of the whole through some kind of God type figure. Although this could be the subject too, right? So there's some grounding ground, the concept for Hegel or something like that. And I feel like if you represent metaphysics this way, you're going to end up in idealism. Because we're starting from the standpoint of what metaphysics is an attempt to interpret the world through the lens of one particular entity. But there could be other entities that we choose, right? Like you could say it's all atoms, or you could say it's all object-oriented ontology or whatever. I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Or you could say it's all water, or, and there's a sense in which this, I think, erases the distinction between materialism and idealism in favor of idealism. Even if the subject is like disappeared, like, or is, out of the picture because the subject is considered metaphysical, we start from this position that we have to give an interpretation of the meaning of being. But you can read the pre-Socratics as materialists, on the other hand, as opposed to ontologists. You can read Thales as saying, what is everything? Everything's made of matter. What is the composition of matter? Well, it's like water, it can change forms, right? Or it's like air, it can change forms. Or Heraclitus, it's like fire, it can change forms. There's a passage in Heraclitus that I love that I did not notice until teaching him last semester, which is the one about just as all things are exchanged for gold and gold for all things, so fire is exchanged for all things and all things for fire, which is very interesting because it kind of shows like a kind of economic category in work in this like early pre-Socratic ontology, or we could call it a form of materialism. And something I noticed too, like Kwame Nkrumah and Conscientism in that first chapter or second, it's either the first or the second chapter, like goes through this kind of materialist reading of the pre-Socratics, and he sees them all as kind of doing a new type of materialism that's thinkable because of the emerging merchant economy of ancient Greece, which is a really fascinating reading.
Richard Seaford has a similar argument, actually. And he talks about that also in terms of selves, like the concept of selves that we see emerge both in the Indian context, because he's actually doing comparisons between India and ancient Greece, and the ancient Greek context seems to be tied to the development of land property as a concept that's pretty, and territorialization as a concept. It's not perfect. I don't know that I completely buy it, but like it is interesting, and I do think that's a good answer to some of the Heideggerian stuff. Like, I think it also becomes clearer when you read outside of just the quote European. And let's be honest, the ancient Anatolians and Greeks are not really Europeans the way we think of them. That's a German myth too. But thank you, German philology, for that bullshit. But this European reading, if you compare them to like Dharmic or Cynic thinkers, you see similar developments and concepts of property. At least that's Richard Seaford's argument.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have to look at that sometime. And yeah, like I mean, the history of Buddhist philosophy, so many similar problems. I mean, early Buddhism is doing stuff that is very phenomenological.
It's
development of dialectics,
right? It's like reading what would have happened if the anti-Platonics won the debate in Greece. Like, I mean, there's also Platonic like thinkers, even in weirdly the Buddhists redevelop it later. But like, but yeah, when you start getting into it, it's very fascinating, and it's actually something that I wish Marxist philosophy. If I have a critique of Marxism, not just Western Marxism, and I hope maybe the Chinese Marxists do more with this and we eventually get it in English, because I can't read Mandarin.
It's hard. I've been trying to learn. Oh my god, Mandarin is hard.
Yeah. I lived in Asia for like 4 years and went to China a bunch, and I could start to mimic tones kind of, but when I started getting into ideogrammatic writing, I was like, oh man, I don't understand this. It breaks my pathetic phonetic Western brain. But nonetheless, it does actually matter for understanding certain translations of Buddhist philosophy, which is why I cared. But you start seeing these parallels and developments, and you just realize, oh my god, we don't study this stuff enough to see that there are maybe corresponding traditions, which also means that even people that I like Lukács, are still fairly Eurocentric. Occasionally you'll get like African Marxists looking at Africana philosophy and doing cross-cultural comparisons and stuff, but there's not a lot of it, and there's not a lot of it available. And unfortunately, a lot of it is available is written by Heideggerians. So like,
yeah, true. Well, yeah, and then you have the Kyoto school and all that too, right? And
yes, you do. The Kyoto school, the Nietzsche Heidegger Buddhist synthesis stuff, like, that stuff is wild.
Yeah. Well, now that I've got my Red Note account, I've been talking with students about philosophy in China. Although I've been like really busy lately, like because I just did like the on Sunday I did like a Rev Left episode on Spinoza, and then trying to figure out all this, other drama that we won't go into, and teaching free and all this stuff. But now, like, every time I look at my phone, I have 100 Red Note notifications, because I don't know if it's like the population or just because people really like philosophy or what. Like, and so I'm like, how do I respond to all of these things? But yeah, like some of the reactions are that Chinese Marxists are kind of more critical towards Buddhism because of tensions with like Tibet and things like this, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So that even makes like I actually understand those tensions from both sides, to be quite honest. But let's and there's a lot of reactionary Buddhist thinkers, actually. I don't want to downplay that at all.
Yeah, do you ever like the Suzuki guy that a lot of people like, you know, like our parents' age, like studied and all this stuff. He's like really
Yeah,
popular.
D.T. Suzuki. Yeah.
Yeah, you heard about what he did like during World War II? Like
Yes.
he would like train like soldiers and be like, oh, like, well, you know, it's all move, right? Like it's all nothing. You can, the knife isn't real, the body you're stabbing isn't real, and stuff like that. So
Right.
quite,
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, that's the book. The book on that is Zen at War, and if you want to get into like Theravada Buddhism, there's some stuff by Buddhologist Donald Lopez on like Theravada nationalism and anti-communism and anti-internationalism and all that. So I don't want to idealize it at all. I really don't.
Yeah.
But
you know, Heidegger tried to translate the Tao Te Ching into German.
I could see that. I could see him like
Can you
trying
imagine
to
what it like?
trying to like somehow redefine both Tao and Dharma as something as equivalent to Dasein.
It's like die Weg, vegan, and
Yeah.
to Wegmans, like I don't know, like
Yeah,
and
that's
yeah,
that's like reading Ezra Pound's translations of Confucius, which is
oh yeah,
also wild, which I have done. It's crazy.
Yeah. I haven't touched like Confucianism or like kind of ancient Chinese philosophy aside from having read the Tao Te Ching and I think maybe one other Taoist philosopher in undergrad. But I'm, you know, now trying to throw this into my ancient syllabus because like my new thing is like whenever I haven't read something, I just teach it. So then I have to know it before the date. Right.
Yeah.
But back to Heidegger.
I do that or do a podcast on it. That's what I do. If I'm gonna like want to learn something, I'm like, I need to find an expert, so I have to read about this.
A lot of the Heidegger like idioms though came from him trying to translate Aristotle because like because he imagines himself as being Aristotle, and so like if you read like Aristotle, like the word for essence, totienenai, like the what it is to be, like Aristotle just made that shit up, right? And so Heidegger thinks like he needs to make shit up as well. Although it's not clear to me, like if you take off your Heidegger glasses and actually like look at being in time, it kind of I'm not sure how much he really needs to like coin these terms. Like, I mean, just like imagine how cheesy this would be if you read someone do this in English, right? And
they sound new age when they do this in English. When you like take normal words and redefine them like that, it often reads to us like new age grifter shit. Which I'm not saying. I actually do think Heidegger's more sophisticated than that.
Yes, of course.
But you know, people, because I've already been attacked for like, oh, you guys just hate Heidegger because of his politics, and I'm like, I think his politics and his thought are directly related. Like,
have you ever? Oh, there's something crazy. I almost like forgot about this until recently. So one of Heidegger's early readings of Leibniz is like, I remember reading it and I was like, I forget what it is. It might be like Metaphysical Foundations of Logic. Right? It's like one of those like from the being in time era prior to the 30s, or at least like on the dot 30s. And he goes through this whole thing with like Leibniz and the PSR and all this stuff, and you expect him to just like do the Heidegger thing, right? Where it's like, oh, we're gonna read this, we're gonna like play around with some words in the original language and make weird German words, and then at one point we're gonna realize that this is all the history of metaphysics, and it all leads to Nietzsche and Marx, and who are just inversions of Hegel, blah blah blah, or you know, this is just, you know, the present at hand, and really like there's a more fundamental like ready to hand, etc. But this is not what he does at the end of this Leibniz seminar. At the end of the Leibniz seminar, he's like, so what we can see is that like the perceptions of the monad are like pulled by the appetitions into the future, like from the past into the present, and Dasein's a fucking monad because it has its world in itself. It's being in the world. And this is like, wow, that is like actually such a great expression of why Heidegger's philosophy has this inherent subjective idealism to it. For those of you who have not studied Leibniz, because he's weird, he's one of those philosophers who sounds crazy, and then when you dig into him, he's even crazier. Because like if you read like his correspondence, Arnaud or whoever like he's corresponding with will be like, Leibniz, That's fucking ape shit, dog. Like, what the hell? Like, that is a very strange position. And Leibniz is like, no, you don't understand. I account for this with some other really crazy position, right? Like he invents, he makes things weirder and weirder to keep his positions afloat. But for Leibniz, everything that exists are minds that are kind of like organisms, but they're numerically one, and they have no spatial extension or anything like that. They're units with no parts that have everything on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
And each contains a world within itself. And there are clouds of these things everywhere that form objects, but they have no relationship with each other. They just all represent the world as a little mind on the inside. And then because of the pre-established harmony, where God has made everything the best of all possible worlds, God has like programmed, as it were, all of the little minds to sync up with each other. So there are like ideal chains linking everything in the clouds of monads that make up all of us. But really, they are just playing according the entire world from their own perspective, according to their own little program, linked up with all the other monads. And then finally, the other interesting claim that Leibniz makes is that every monad perceives the entire world from its perspective. And just to give a kind of frame of reference, our minds are monads, and they're linked up to the monads that make up our bodies, which are made of more monads that are linked to more monads to more monads to more monads, because Leibniz claims that all organisms are organisms all the way down to infinity. But he claims that we perceive events everywhere in the world right now. So right now we're perceiving China at a very low degree of intensity.
So this is the as above, so below, but written into like literal idealist metaphysics of cognition. Like,
yeah,
okay.
And that instead of matter, he has little minds everywhere.
So he's a idealist, animist, kind of. I guess that's
He's
fascinating.
just Leibniz, I think, honestly. Everything is numeric, made of things that are ones. With no parts, no extension.
Yeah, I mean, Leibniz is one of these guys that I know from his debates with like Voltaire, and I know by comparing him to Spinoza, who I find more rational. But I actually haven't read a lot of Leibniz, so it's just always wild when I read like what he says.
Leibniz is really strange because he always seems to be in a hurry. So all he doesn't have like one big systematic work. He's just like, here is my system. It's 5 pages, got to go by. And then like later he's like, here is my system. It's 5 pages, got to go by. And they're all kind of different from each other, but they all like harmonize with each other. Kind of like the monads. And then he has his correspondence. And then, but like the monads are slightly different. So we're like, oh, is this the de Bose's monad? But yeah, you can read. I'll give you a list of stuff, but like you can read Leibniz in a day very easily. It's weird, but it's very easy and very short, and fun. But this is a weird thing for Heidegger to like read Leibniz, the weirdest metaphysician in early modern philosophy, and be like, "Yep, Dasein's a monad." But it makes sense when you realize that Leibniz thinks that the monad carries the entire world within itself. And that's kind and it's there's these appetitions, which are like the only two features of the monads are the perceptions and the appetitions. The appetitions are he changes his words a ton too. They're entelechies. They're like self-movement. Like it's like a principle of self-movement that just pushes perceptions for the entire world at different degrees of perception based on the location of the monad forward. In like ecstatic temporality does for the whole world around Dasein. It's really, really strange. I'm gonna have to go like look back at that maybe whenever I write parts 2 and 3, which who knows when that will happen.
Yeah, you gotta finish a bunch of stuff like your dissertation first.
Yeah,
but
that actually is going well. I have 250 pages of Hegel already, so
good job.
Yeah, the the technology stuff might be something we should maybe touch on real quick, because I feel like
let's talk about tech, because that's one of the things where leftists tend to be somewhat more sympathetic to Heidegger. So what's the critique there?
Yeah, okay, so let me give an overview of Heidegger's view of technology first. So Heidegger sees technology as a interpretation of the meaning of being. Mm-hmm. He gives some strange claims of tracing this back to techne. I'm not sure if I could give that argument off the top of my head, but essentially he sees it as an expression of what Nietzsche calls the will to power, specifically the will to keep on willing. And so here's the idea. If technology you could think of as like use values, right? It's weird too, because it resonates with his description of technology actually sounds a lot like the ontology in Being and Time, right? But like, I have a stapler, and it can exercise my will by like stapling things, right? What technology does in the 20th century is it makes everything present in the form of what Heidegger calls the standing reserve, which is this idea of like the like it's on. He gives the example of a plane on the runway ready to take off in case someone needs to go somewhere. So like technology is like providing us with stuff that we will things that secure the possibility of future willing if we wish to. And even science, he thinks, it's like we measure all of the particles in the atmosphere or whatever to kind of unlock them for the possibility of changing them and making them useful for human willing. And Heidegger calls this the enframing, das Gestell. And there's a sense in which, like I remember I talked to my German professor about this, and she said, "Oh yeah, like frames," because that's like a double meaning to it that you wouldn't necessarily notice. That like it's a worldview where everything appears just as something that's at hand that you can exercise your will upon. And even like nature, like a park is like a version of the Gestell, because you're like, we have nature standing by, ready for people to go experience it. Which is, it's interesting. It's interesting as a way to describe things. The water of the river, instead of being the water described by Hölderlin, becomes something that we can harness using the dam power or whatever. And so everything becomes unlocked in terms of its like ability to be an object for our will to power. And Heidegger thinks that this alongside with science and technology, and science and technology, he thinks that science and technology have taken over the role that he thought belonged to philosophers. And maybe in this sense, he is kind of infected with what Lukács talks about as a kind of spontaneous ideology of the petty bourgeois intellectual, which is that he thought that he was the one who gets to decide what being is, and now it's the scientists and technology people or whatever. But the danger of technology is that Heidegger thinks we will never be able to see anything any other way than as a fully revealed, fully disclosed scientific picture of everything. And if you think about like what a scientific theory reveals, it reveals what you can do and what you can change about the thing that you understand. And as Marxists, that's our criterion of truth is praxis already, right? So there's a sense in which when he says that Marx and Nietzsche are the inverted Hegelianisms that reveal everything in terms of the will, he's not wrong. Like Marx's theory of scientific validity as what can prove itself through praxis does involve exercising our will. He seems to think that the German peasant, here we go again with German peasants, experienced nature differently because they go along with nature and don't challenge upon it. I forget what the German term being translated here is. So they just plant the seeds and it grows along with the soil. Whereas modern agriculture tries to it's the robbery of nature. It tries to strip the soil or maximize the yield of the soil and challenges the soil to give its most powerful fruit bearing capacities, I guess. And so I think a lot of leftists are easily swayed by this Heideggerian account because it sounds like science bad, technology bad, causing us to see all of the earth and all the environment as just a resource for human use, which is going to create environmental catastrophes and things like this because, you know, how dare we play God and fuck with nature kind of thing. Now,
I mean, this leads to people who like both Heidegger and somehow also like, and I have critiques of them too, but also like a Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, and they'll cite them both as if they're not diametrically opposed to each other. But go ahead.
Yeah, and so I'm not super familiar with the Frankfurt School because I kind of skipped like Western Marxism, and then until I read Lasordo, and now I'm kind of like going back, like because I would just, you know, I just read like the classic texts.
Right. Yeah, I unfortunately came wrong-sided. I started with the Frankfurt School and read the classic text, and came back to the Frankfurt School and was like, I don't know, but
yeah. But every time I read Adorno, I'm like, bro, you're Heidegger. I thought you hated Heidegger. Like, and because the dialectic of enlightenment, it sounds like this kind of Heideggerian position.
It does.
Yeah, and so
he does hate Heidegger, though. I mean, but it is interesting because you also, I mean, we forgot to mention one of the key transitionary figures, Marcuse, who is the Heideggerian Marxist. Like, because you can't, because you're right, like you can't read One Dimensional Man without some of this Heidegger's critique of technology, like definitely being in there.
Yeah, and so like, what's weird though about the environmental side of it is that in a weird way, even trying to stop climate change is somehow connected to the will to power and Gestalt. I think,
right?
Like,
yes,
yeah, like because you're still like, I think Heidegger even makes a comment that's almost like this, because you're still trying to like save nature. You're just like just because we caused it or whatever, but like your purpose is about rounding up all the carbon and figuring out ways that there's not so much of it.
Okay, so here's I mean, Heidegger would lead you to like super fatalism almost.
I mean, I think he just wants to like go dress up as a peasant and go to his garden, man. Like, I don't even know.
Right.
But yeah, there could be a kind of fatalism or nihilism to it. Okay, so here's the critique. The environmental crisis is not a result of technology or things being connected to our own will or our will to power, us utilizing them, like them being objects for our utility. The environmental crisis is a result of building our entire economies around exchange value.
Right.
And maximizing the production of things for the purpose of exchange value. Because even like, right? Like, because if we actually like were focused, like, I would take it back to this use value, exchange value distinction. Because if we actually were trying to like rationally calculate things to our own advantage, we would address externalities like climate catastrophes. Right.
Yeah. Right. I mean, like, yes, because ultimately, you know, we would do what the libertarians say that capital would do, but we can see clearly capital has no incentive to ever do, which is rationally allocate resources because it's stupid to waste them. But, you know, Marx makes it very clear that once you get into abstract value accumulation and that becomes your driving teleological framework, you'll burn through almost anything to maintain it, and like including
Yeah.
capital itself, apparently. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, and I haven't seen the market allocate the 15.1 million empty homes to the 500,000 homeless people in the U.S. yet. So I don't know.
Right.
That's always the number I pull out for my students. Of like, I was like, how many homes do you think are unoccupied in the U.S.? How many homeless people do you think there are? How many more homes do you think there are than homeless people? Right, but
yeah,
that aside,
it's absurd. Like,
yeah. But then
um,
we go back to like the whole ontology and metaphysics and idealism aspect of things. Hold on a second. What Heidegger is claiming is like what ontology is that or technology as metaphysics, it's determining what can count as a being, right? That's what ultimately ontology is for Heidegger. What is the meaning of being? What counts as a being? What does it mean for something to be? According to Heidegger in the 20th century, it means to be an object that's manipulatable, that's scientifically describable and manipulatable by technology. Which honestly is not far from what I would say the actual definition of being is anyway. Like, I mean, because I'm kind of a scientific realist, but that aside, for Heidegger, like being is kind of still phenomenal. And I'll make another point about that in a second. Like, it is still a mode of appearance for things. For Marx, though, Marx says the opposite, that the mode of appearance of things is actually not its use value, it's its exchange value.
right.
It's commodity, right? The form of appearance of wealth in the capitalist age of production, to paraphrase it loosely, the first sentence of Capital, is a world of commodities. That's the way that things appear. And if you have a materialist account, like what the materialist account would reveal is the use values, the actual wealth, the actual what's actually materially being produced and can be utilized rationally. But this appears in this form of exchange. Whereas Heidegger thinks that that is actually the appearance, the rationally utilizable, real material, scientifically describable things. Because science for him is ultimately just a way of revealing being according to certain presuppositions and basic concepts.
Which makes sense in a way for him. I'm not saying in general, but if you assume that being is rooted in Dasein, like the being of the human, the thingness of the human, and thus the perception of that thingness, everything is just subjected to that anyway. Right. Like, so science would not be something that we engage with where our engagement with the world is phenomenologically relative to this or that, but we are approaching some kind of objective truth, you know, struggling though we may be. The embracing the Hegelian / Marxist critique of positivism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in Heidegger, you are, and in some ways, it almost feels like mere subjectivity.
Yeah, it's like objectivity is like a choice for Heidegger. You're choosing to objectify things and you're stripping them from their worldliness according to certain procedures and principles. Now, there are things in Heidegger's tool being, or tool, not tool being, that's a Harman book, tool analysis, that are cool for Marxist analysis. There's also one place in Capital where Marx says, like, when you look at the the worker receives like the raw materials and there's a flaw in them, that they notice the other worker that produced it in the flaw, which is kind of like the breakdown thing in Heidegger. So there's like a weird Heideggerian moment in Marx too when it comes to, because for Heidegger, he says you don't notice the hammer when you're swinging it, you only notice when it breaks, and that's what turns it into an object. There's a line where Marx says something very similar about the raw materials being broken. But that aside, what objectivity is for Heidegger is it's like staring at something with a certain like theoretical lens and isolating it from this context of practical activity and engagement that is ultimately rooted in Dasein's own existence and world, which is it's like a structure of Dasein. But what I wanted to say too on this topic of this whole correlationism. That's the term Marx uses for this like idealist position that there's no outside.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that's really revealing is Husserl's margin notes in his copy of Being and Time. They're in the Husserliana, and I've read them. And one of them I remember distinctly is like as Husserl's going and he's starting to be like more and more like, what the fuck is this, Heidegger? He writes in one of the margins, all of this in a phenomenological reduction. For Husserl, in Husserl's phenomenology, the epoche, the phenomenological reduction, the idea like we're only going to look at what appears to us. We're going to bracket the natural attitude, which assumes that what I see is a real thing out there. He said we're going to put that aside using a deliberate skeptical procedure. This is a method for Husserl. And that method actually kind of changes how we look at what's in our perceptual apparatus. But Husserl will switch back and forth between natural attitude and then phenomenological attitude to draw points of contrast. Because Husserl is all about trying to find these like essences within consciousness and these necessary claims that he can make about the structure of consciousness. There's no epoche. Like maybe there is like in a weird sense in the anxiety chapter, like there's no epoche in Heidegger in the sense that he said, I'm going to bracket being or bracket reality or whatever. Yet Heidegger kind of is in a phenomenologically reduced sense the entire time. It just almost seems like that's all he thinks there is. And this kind of extreme idealism too is very compatible with fascism, I think, really. Like where everything is like, if everything is just, I would really like to like have a clear, I'm a Cartesian at heart. I would really like to have a clear and distinct idea of like why there's some need for fascist ideology to be like the most subjective forms of idealism and everything to just be mind and subjectivity and opinions and things like this. You see this in Dugin too. Dugin has a chapter on Husserl in the Fourth Political Theory book. Do you remember that chapter?
Oh yeah. Yes.
That has there's no Husserl in that chapter. Like what the hell is that chapter? He's like
no. I mean like no,
but it's a weird chapter.
I mean, Dugin's one of these people who like starts. I mean, one of the things I pointed out in my reading of like his first chapter, but not even in the Husserl chapter, but like where he's basically arguing that cultures are basically, to use a metaphysical concept from Wu Land, aggregors, that we should give rights but not people. So we should give like the concept of German identity or the concept of Russian identity rights, but people don't get that because the ideas are more real than than I mean, you know, and
it's such
and
an
at first
book, yeah.
Right. Well, at first I thought when he was talking about liberalism does this, liberalism does that, I was like, okay, he's making that like representative problem where we use the abstract in a hypostaticized way to represent the things underneath it. We all do that. I get it. But then now, as I read the book, I'm like, no, I think he actually believes this literally. Like, you know, that liberalism is like a thought process that we get into and then like we do these things and it's liberalism controlling us. And I'm like,
yeah,
okay.
No, yeah, maybe that's the connection. Because you get that in Jordan Peterson too.
Yes, you did.
Yeah, there's a Reddit post that went like really viral. I would still get messages from Peterson supporters. I used to be really active in Ask Philosophy under a pseudonym. And people would always send my critique of Peterson because we were all like, don't read Peterson. He's not a real philosopher. And then people were like, tell us what's wrong with him. And I was like, show me something he's written. And like his book hadn't come out. So like, it's just like YouTube. I'm like, I'm not fucking listening to YouTube, y'all. Like, give me a text. And someone showed me a speech. Anyways, so I did a close analysis of it. And that's his thing is Peterson's postmodernism is something that grips you and gets into your consciousness and makes you woke, right? And similarly with Dugin and liberalism, except he wants to take part of liberalism, namely the equality and freedom, but have it be for not individuals and just be for cultures, right?
Right, yeah.
Yep. The weird contradiction for him is that he's like, did you see his debate with or a discussion with Tucker Carlson?
Yes, I did actually.
Yeah. Yeah, like yeah, you remember like so like Dugin was like we are Russians, like we are traditional, like we do not, buy your LGBTQ wokeness. Like that's for you. We're okay with you having that. We just don't want it for us because it's not our tradition. And Tucker Carlson's like, I don't think it's America's tradition either. I'm an American traditionalist. And then it's like I just like realized like, oh, it's just like every appeal to tradition is just I mean of course you're gonna whatever you hate you're just gonna say that's it's traditional to not like that thing, right? Like
right.
every
I hate to go all like
reactionary.
Hobbes bomb, but most traditions are invented specifically for that purpose. Like,
right, yeah. Yeah, like but yeah, his reading of Husserl, which has nothing to do with Husserl in any sense whatsoever, is like this time consciousness where literally all that exists is like the infinitesimal now.
Yeah.
Like that's nuts.
Yeah,
and then
it's just
he tries
which
to
means
move
all that
there.
exists is perception too. It's what it would imply. But yeah.
Yeah, he tries to move from that to it's funny because he shall not be named from Twitter argues that the reason you need Dugin and not just Heidegger is because he says that like Dugin can take Dasein and make it cultural Dasein, right? Mm-hmm. That move, like Dugin in the fourth political theory, like there's some kind of crazy leap there, like where he actually can't get from the like all that exists is the now of consciousness to like, which seems radically individualistic, to like folk or people or culture, ethnos or whatever he calls it, right? Like there's like this slippage there, which is weird because I think Heidegger totally, if you read Heidegger more carefully, maybe he could make that move. I didn't read all of his book on Heidegger though, so maybe he gives a more detailed account there. But
yeah, I have read 4 Dugin books and he contradicts himself a lot, so it's hard to actually know. Like
I read, never contradicts himself on the fascism stuff, besides calling it something different each time.
No, he does not. It's also funny because he basically relies on the most vulgar liberal understanding of fascism as racial nationalism, as Karl Popper's racial nationalism, to distance everything he says for fascism. And then I point out that Mussolini's fascism is definitely copacetic with what you're talking about. But yeah, it's wild. I mean, maybe we should thank the Duginists for reminding us that Heidegger has a right-wing reading, though, that's actually really easy to do because they make that obvious.
I mean,
we're not just dealing with decolonial theorists anymore and Derrida fans.
Yeah. Yeah, with the decolonial theorists, where I made some critiques of them. I mean, like, I'm like really open to like the idea that there are like with the guy Keanu. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I remember reading him in undergrad, and I was just like, even if he was critical when he's critical of Marxism, I was like, oh, this seems like something worth taking seriously or whatever. Mm-hmm. But then it gets really strange. Like we're now like it's kind of like Heidegger, but for decolonial theory, where I mean, I haven't seen the receipts for Descartes' connection to Cortez. Maybe there are receipts somewhere in a book that I've never seen. But just because I think therefore I am sounds like I conquer therefore I am, like, like you can't just like,
yeah, that's an incredibly weak.
It came from Europe, so it must be colonial, except for Heidegger and Levinas. We'll keep those, the Nazi and the Zionists. We'll just keep them. They're fine, but everyone else, right? Like,
yeah. Don't get me on my whole. There's a strain of Afro-pessimism that is Heideggerian that really rhymes with Zionism.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I haven't delved into that yet.
Not all of it. I wouldn't condemn all of it, but some of it.
Because I've had some people I respect tell me that some of it is like really worth like considering, and So
No, yeah, I think people should struggle with Fred Wilkinson even if they don't agree with him. Uh, I wouldn't. I mean, look, despite what people think, we aren't telling you not to read Heidegger. We're
right.
telling you not to be mystified by Heidegger.
Yeah.
Or Heidegger scholars who want to take these concepts and just pretend there's no relation to Heidegger's politics, and I think we can't do that.
Right.
Like,
Right.
I
And then
don't think
also too,
ideas are you can just like I'm not a Deleuzian. I don't think you can just carte blanche like, oh, I like this from here and this from here and just throw it together and it makes sense. Like,
yeah, like where he likes Socrates' critique of dialect, or he likes Nietzsche's critique of Socrates' dialectic when he uses it against Hegel, but not when he uses it against Hegel because he claims that Socrates was racially inferior, right?
right? Yeah, that.
Have you seen that? Like,
yes.
Yeah. So it's weird too because like people always just like shift what Heidegger is like the trendy Heidegger too, right? So like I think the contributions for a while was like really cool, and that's written in his like in the 30s. So
right.
some sketchy stuff in there for sure. But it's also just like very weird. There's all this last god stuff, and he's trying to develop the Erignus. And I don't know, like I remember just like whenever Heideggerians debate, they just throw Heidegger's terms at each other until someone gets lost, and then whoever gets lost loses. I feel like sometimes it ends up like that. Not all Heideggerians, but I just remember like a lot of that growing up, of who could like show that they've mastered the concepts enough. And I'm like really skeptical and like worried about how in a lot of continental philosophy, we're kind of thrust into like language games without really knowing the stakes of the language games. So let me give an example. The other. My entire first semester of one of my programs, 2 different classes were just like, but can Hegel deal with alterity? But can Heidegger deal with alterity? But what senses of alterity is there in Heidegger? But is there any alterity? And even like the Marxist students are trying to like jump on board, and it's like, okay, so now we got to figure out about like alterity. What is alterity? And like, how does it fit into this? And I'm sitting there like, what? Can somebody just please explain to me why a system needs to account for alterity? Is this politics? Is there something like going on here? Like, is the other like, I don't know, the immigrant or something? Like, I genuinely don't know what we're talking about when we say the other. It turned out by the end of the semester that there were 2 different discussions going on, where one of the professors was a theologian and the other was God, and the other was a Derridian, so the other was like more conceptual, I think, and not theological. But you get into these. It's similar to the whole like totalities equal totalitarianism thing, right? Like, well, I don't want to have a totalizing philosophy because all my professors have said that's a bad thing, right? And so I don't want to be accused of it. And I feel like a lot of kind of ideological indoctrination happens through these kinds of conceptual associations when we don't actually really work out what we mean by them. Metaphysics, that's another one, right? No one wants to be considered metaphysics or doing metaphysics or metaphysical. Yet I think the term metaphysics means very different things for different philosophers.
Absolutely.
Right? So for Aristotle, it means first philosophy. I didn't realize this, but the reason it doesn't mean that in like Hegel or Kant is because Kant has a critique of this claim that metaphysics is first philosophy. Because he says like, this is ambiguous. Because when does the first part end and the second part begin? Because he says something along the lines of like, okay, you say all extended things are like subject to, or all bodies are extended. He's like, okay, that's metaphysics. What about all liquid bodies are extended? Are we still doing metaphysics? You know, and like he's worried about that specification. Yet even among the German idealists, there's this like shift in what metaphysics means between different German idealists. for some of the early ones, it just means like something that can determine the thing in itself. But if you look at Hegel, it doesn't mean that, because Hegel thinks that metaphysics was right in thinking that it could know the thing in itself. For Hegel, this is controversial, but I think I have the textual evidence for it. I think Hegel and Engels have a very similar definition of metaphysics, where metaphysics is opposed to dialectical thinking. Metaphysics is the abstract understanding. You get to Heidegger, what is metaphysics? It's ontotheology. It's this attempt to give this account of being in general and being as a whole. Then you go to Derrida, and metaphysics is somehow both the Hegelian and the Heideggerian definition.
Right.
I'm not sure if there's anywhere where Derrida says this is what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is presence. Right. That's another one of Heidegger's argument, where that there's actually some historical backing to this claim. So he says that existence, I mean this in a non-Heideggerian sense, has been associated with existence in the present moment, existence in the now, and has not had the future or tense or past tense given to it. Like, right, we say that dinosaurs don't exist because they don't exist now. We say that they won't exist in the future or whatever, like, or, you know, the future does not exist because it's not here yet, things like this. Or if we say that the future exists, we imagine it as a present that is not yet, right, somewhere, or the past is like in a container somewhere because it was present back then. There is some like etymological work. Like there's an essay called The Greek Verb to Be. That's a really kind of famous essay by Charles Kahn, written in, I think it was in the 60s, on this topic, where he talks about this present tense preference in ancient Greek philosophy. But that's like another aspect, this whole like metaphysics of presence thing that gets Derrida takes up, where for Derrida it's the thinking of being in terms of like stable presence hides this play of signifiers, this play of difference that ultimately like differs meaning, which is I think very similar to his, like, it's kind of his attempt to take like some stuff from ecstatic temporality and like structuralism and make it more of a structuralist move with presence. But this is another thing, like, what's wrong with presence, right? Like, you know,
right, yeah.
I
mean, that's a basic question. I mean, one of the things I find very frustrating, and this can come out of phenomenological thinkers of all types, and you can also do the other thing the analytic philosophers do and overdefine stuff, but there is a lot of equivocation in this, like, deconstruction between concepts in Hegel and concepts in Heidegger, particularly, that are just like thrown around as if they're talking about the same thing. And like in Derrida, I remember being utterly confused by this when I first read this, being like, what? Like, huh? And I think you're right. Like, what do people mean by metaphysics? For years, Colin, I couldn't figure out why ontology wasn't metaphysics, knowing what I know about the Aristotelian definition of metaphysics. So, you know,
is it or is it not? That's the question. I think, like,
right.
Yeah. Like, I mean, like traditionally it is. Metaphysics traditionally is metaphysics generalis, which includes ontology. And then special metaphysics, which is cosmology, psychology, and I'm missing one. Theology. I think. Right? The world, the soul, God. And then I think another aspect of general metaphysics, and this might help some things click, because it helped me put some things together. Modal claims are metaphysical, like possibility, contingency, things like this, right?
Right, yeah.
And then that actually makes sense of like, oh, so that's why analytic metaphysics is metaphysics in the 1960s.
Right. Yes, that makes sense.
Right? Because they say like, oh, like, this is true across all possible worlds. It's modally necessary. So that's a metaphysical side to it. And but for Heidegger, it's so caught. Like, one of the reasons I quit Heidegger is I just like started realizing that all I know how to do is think about being.
Right.
And people like started talking about like difference and contradiction and like the part and the whole and all this stuff. And I'm like, wait, there are other concepts besides being. Why have I just been on like page 1 of Hegel's Logic? I could have been doing all of these other fun things. And it was really that limitation of Heidegger that pushed me away from him. I mean, he does talk about like difference, but I don't know. That essay is really weird. He doesn't say it as much as he should in a lot of essays. Some of his like early stuff when he's really, really careful though is has some like, you know, he has some good work, I think, on the history of philosophy when he was younger, especially. He made all of his students know Greek before they could take his class.
Which is impressive.
Yeah. I mean, back then, I guess people knew that stuff. I wish I've done the basic ancient Greek like on my own once, but yeah, like I definitely couldn't be in a Heidegger class on it.
That's true. I will admit that Aristotle started making a lot more sense with me when I started like getting the technical terms like in Greek a little better.
Yeah.
And that made a lot of 19th and early 20th century German philosophy make more sense.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, my brain was scrambled when I studied this stuff because on one hand, I was coming from the very deconstructionist era of critical literary theory when I was an English major. And then I was studying philosophy and anthropology together, and it was analytic or it was anthropological. It wasn't continental. And I got obsessed with Nietzsche and Hegel, but like I said, through very conservative Southern professors. So it was, it took me a while. And Heidegger, I think, was both obviously right-wing to me, but also heavily mystified. But I don't think it's all bad. I would like, it's funny that people react to us critiquing them or saying like, oh, you can't really base a left-wing philosophy off of Nietzsche and Heidegger, with saying, oh, you should never read them.
Right.
Like I don't think we should be basing our philosophy off of Hobbes, but I love reading Hobbes.
Oh my gosh. I just taught Hobbes. It was great.
Right. It's, it's wild. And there's some wild stuff in Hobbes. Like when you realize,
I was just going through Hobbes for fun earlier today, honestly. Like I was thinking about, because I just did the Spinoza thing.
Right.
And then I was like, I should really go look back up Hobbes's analysis of conatus. It's wild.
Right.
Because like what the conatus is like motion particles have entered the body and remain in the body, by which I mean imagination. Because there are no such things. Like, what is an idea for Hobbes? Decaying motion in the senses.
Right.
Yeah, and what the conatus is those little bitty beginnings of motion still in the body from what has entered into the imagination. Because memory is just imagination with the thought of past.
Right. Yeah. Which is actually somewhat insightful and a little bit accurate. But like how he gets there, I mean, one of the things I go off on is like you kind of have to understand that Hobbes is not, a lot of people read him as atheist, and he might be but he's closer to Spinoza, that he seems to believe that God is a literal material being, like the ancient Stoics. And that everything, including ideas maybe, are literal material things. And it either has to do with matter or motion and some relation between the two, which is fascinating for that time period in particular, because it's so close to a modern outlook and also so not a modern outlook.
Yeah. Yeah. All these people, I guess, probably reading Lucretius in secret at this time.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's clearly like there's Lucretius all up in this, and you're absolutely correct. So just because we say that you can't base a left-wing philosophy off of it doesn't mean we don't think you should read it or learn from it. In fact, I think it's actually important to understand where some of this thought comes from and how you deal with it. And also to admit some of it is in its own way genius. Even if I think it's utterly corrupting.
And like a lot of people are kind of like, because Gabriel is doing his Gabriel thing right now of criticizing the canon, And but at the same time, he's been very clear that it's like, no, you should definitely be reading all these people. And it's funny, the Lasorda book has me actually wanting to go read Marcuse and the Frankfurt School and Bloch and all this stuff like really carefully now. But like from his vantage point, like he studied with Derrida and studied with Badiou and read all these people in the original language. And his kind of position is that like you shouldn't think that you need to do all of those things to be a good leftist. That's actually distracting you from things that are probably more important on the agenda. But if you're a Marxist working in professional philosophy, good time to pick up this stuff and start criticizing, Now, there are probably also other important things to be doing, like more so than just criticizing philosophy. I think a lot more important things to do. But
yeah, I mean,
not like you shouldn't do it at the same time. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. No one's forbidding you to do it. There is like we can only focus on so many things at once. But I think like really what people are saying is that you don't need to. You don't need Nietzsche in your Marxism. You don't need Heidegger in your Marxism. You can go read these people. And I think even like if you wanted to understand the history of fascism, you probably should understand how these philosophers fit into it. Also, Heidegger can teach you things about just being a human being because, he wasn't wrong about everything. Yeah, like I remember writing my honors thesis while reading Being and Time and understanding being towards death because my 22-year-old mind was like, I've got to finish this honors thesis because I'm going to die one day. Right? Like,
it's a very basic motivational strategy, but it's a pretty good one.
Yeah. Like, and yeah, the analyses of angst is really interesting, there's a lot of weird stuff going on with that. It's also interesting to take Heidegger and Hegel and see if you can figure out where they're coming into tension with all this like negativity and nothing and the nothing not stuff. One thing, there is a analysis of boredom. Have you ever read that?
Yes.
Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics.
Yes,
I always think about that because I remember reading the boredom part and finding it way less interesting than the stuff on animals and Uxkol and all of that. And I remember reading it and thinking of what is called thinking, where Heidegger's always like, but we are not yet thinking. And then I'll like talk about whatever. He's like, but we are not yet thinking. And I kept just being like, we're talking about boredom, but we are not yet bored enough. Like, let's bore us some more with this boredom, right? So
yes. I feel that way with Derrida a lot too. Well, Colin, where can people find your work?
Yeah, well, I'm mostly on Twitter. I just started TikTok though, where I'm going to be doing some philosophy stuff, also posting stuff from Red Note on there. But yeah, I also have an article that just came out on Hegel's critique of Kant's moral postulates, which is forthcoming in Idealistic Studies, but it's available in online first. Or if you would like a copy, hit me up. I'm happy to send you a copy. So yeah.
All right. Thank you
so much for having me.
It was fun. I really enjoyed it. All right.
Yeah,
and you'll be back. I want you back on to talk about Hegel because that's actually your primary field of research right now. So
yeah, I'd love to.
All right.
So
see you back on then. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.